I'm Francis Dearnley, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, as the world continues to react to the Russian bombardment of Ukrainian cities, we hear from our senior reporter in the Donbas and look deeper into the mysterious Wagner group.
This hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
Ukraine can win, Ukraine must win, and Ukraine will win.
Nobody's gonna break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Wednesday, the 12th of October, day 231, and today I'm joined by Associate Editor Dominic Nicholls, Senior Reporter Roland Oliphant, who is in Ukraine, and our Russia correspondent, Natalia Vasilyeva. I started off by asking Dom for the latest military developments of the past 24 hours.
Well, hi, Francis, and hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us again. It's been still a very, very active 24 hours. The Russian strikes in response to the Kerch Bridge attack incident, however you want to call it. We'll talk about that a bit later. Continued, albeit at a slightly lower scale. Ukraine says that it's reclaimed 5 villages in the Kherson region. A lot of activity in the Donbas as well, but it seems to be the focus in the last 24 hours was down south. So a number of areas reclaimed, and that steady advance there down to the sort of along the edge of the Dnipro River down towards the city of Kherson. Also in that area, 4 Russian Ka-52 attack helicopters were shot down. I mean, that's quite significant. I mean, they are good aircraft. They are good attack helicopters, and to lose 4 is really quite significant. I mean, it speaks of the air defence network that Ukraine has built up around there, and air defence I will come back to as well in a short while. But aside from that, there have been continued missile strikes from Russia across Ukraine, shelling in the Ardivka village or area just north of Donetsk. 7 civilians killed there, a number of wounded. Ukrainian General Staff say that in the last 24 hours, 30 cruise missiles, Kh-101 and Kh-55 cruise missiles, 30 cruise missiles fired from aircraft, from Tu-95, so Tupolev, Tu-95 and Tu-160 strategic bombers, quite old bombers, but they still do the job. This has continued the what we've seen of air-launched missiles, so well away from any air defence umbrella that Ukraine can put up. So those aircraft were probably either over the Black Sea or over Russia. But also, I mean, so those blasts damaged critical infrastructure in Lviv, in Donetsk, in Zaporizhia, and in a number of other towns in the sort of west of the country, not quite as far over as Lviv, nowhere near that, more in the centre west of the country. Ukraine say that their air defence shot down 21 of the cruise missiles, so 21 of the 30, and 11 drones, 11 UAVs, uninhabited air vehicles. They're saying that 8 Shahed 136 drones were destroyed in the vicinity of Mykolaiv. That's down near Kherson on the Monday, Tuesday night. That was the sort of in that region. So, and sorry, I'm pausing because I always get wrapped up about how to describe these things. So today's UK Defence Intelligence report is describing these Shahed 136 drones as one-way drones. Now, a lot of people dislike the term kamikaze drones or suicide drones. That is an easy shorthand, which journalists love hanging on to, but it kind of explains it. One-way drones, I don't like the phrase. Not totally enamored with kamikazes, but the point is that drones that many of us have seen before, worked with, played with, are aware of, normally have kind of cameras on board or some other form of electronic attack, or they're there for other reasons. This new breed of drones, bits like the US Switchblade family, have the Bayraktar, the Turkish Bayraktar that Ukraine have used so well, so efficiently. And these drones are designed to not only relay a picture back to the controller, back somewhere, but then also have a warhead on themselves. So the Shahed 136 has a 50-kilogram warhead, so not a massive blast, but big enough to ruin your day. And the point is that the human can decide what to go for. So what's the priority today? Is it tanks to stop an advance? Is it air defence to allow our own forces to punch through? Is it headquarters, or what is it? And then the controller can direct the drone into that piece of any equipment or headquarters or whatever it is. So that's where the phrase kamikaze or suicide comes in. UK Defence Intelligence calling it one-way drones. I mean, you pay your money, you take your choice. I think I'm going to stick with kamikaze because it really does sort of wrap it up neatly. But UK Defence Intelligence is saying that these drones, the Shahed 136, they are, quote, unlikely to be satisfactorily fulfilling the deep strike function which Russia aspired to use it for. They go on to say that in the first wave, as in the immediate response to the Kerch Bridge blast, 86 Shaheeds were used, and Ukraine shot down about 60. Well, they're saying 60% of them, so about 52 of the 86 was shot down. UK Defence Intelligence saying, quote, the lack of a reliable, sustainable and accurate operational level strike capability, operational level being sort of not tactical, so not just what's around the corner, what's in the next building, what's over the next hill, but operational. Think of it largely, for ease of shorthand, in terms of distance, so let's say 50-ish Ks plus. The lack of that operational level strike capability is likely one of Russia's most significant capability gaps in Ukraine. So they're really saying that with the Russian Air Force very, very reluctant to go anywhere outside Russia, and certainly not beyond the line of their own troops, which of course is in flux at the moment, north and south, less so in the centre. But the Russian Air Force really are not going forward because of the very capable Ukrainian air defence network. That function, that those eyes in the sky, and nowadays marrying the eyes and a weapon in the sky with these kamikaze drones, Russia is really significantly lacking in that capability. Lots of other little bits and pieces about what's happening today in NATO and some other stuff, but I better just pause for breath there.
Thanks, Dom. I just wanted to ask a question of you, if I may, before we turn to Roland and Natalia. There's been an enormous amount of speculation about how the bridge attack at the weekend was carried out by the Ukrainians. Just wondered whether you had any more thoughts about the most likely scenario that the Ukrainians carried out in order to do that attack.
Yeah, sure. So let's just recap. So Saturday morning, early morning, the Kerch Bridge, the 12K bridge, longest bridge in Europe, that links Crimea to Russia, opened with great fanfare by President Putin, was subject to a very large blast. Now, the bridge itself, there are two bridges. There's a road bridge and a rail bridge that runs next to each other. The road bridge has two roadways, basically, and the rail bridge has two rail lines. So that if you like, there are four means of movement across the bridge. Very early in the morning on Saturday, there was a huge explosion, which seemed to be seated on, above, or under. I'll come back to that. The road bridge that seems to have caused a massive fire in a train convoy that happened to be passing at the time, carrying fuel. So the train convoy was stopped. Huge blast. By the time the images got out on social media, the only thing on fire was the rail line. The road bridge, there was nothing there. I mean, literally nothing there. Some of the road had fallen into, one of the spans had fallen into the water, into the Sea of Azov there. Now, what caused it? Fairly early on, speculation went onto a truck. There was some very large vehicle-borne IED, or a vehicle-borne IED, improvised explosive device. Question marks. It might not have been improvised if it was a Ukrainian bomb, so it wouldn't have been improvised. However, the truck came from Russia and was travelling towards Crimea, so unlikely that it was a pre-placed munition on that truck. So we think it might have been a vehicle-borne IED. possibly a suicide bomber, a suicide driver, because whoever was driving that thing wasn't coming out of there. So possibly a SVB IED in the military jargon, suicide vehicle-borne improvised explosive device. There was other speculation that actually the blast came from the rail lines, and that the road line was then just sort of caught up in it. I think that's very doubtful, because the blast that then causes the road to collapse into the sea, I don't think could have been a byproduct of whatever happened on the rail line. So we think the seat of it was on the road, or was on the road side. Now, whether it was above at some sort of missile strike, it would be a very, very accurate missile, which they do have access to, HIMARS, although probably out of range here. It's more in line with the ATACMS, the Advanced Tactical Missile System of the US. These very long range, very precise, very big missiles, but US have repeatedly stated they have not supplied them and have no intention of supplying those munitions, 300k plus range, to Ukraine. So unlikely it was a missile. Again, it would have had to been extremely accurate and a very big blast to cause the thing to collapse. So did it come from underneath? There was early on, there was some speculation that TV cameras that are mounted underneath the bridge showed some sort of wake, which might have been a craft of some kind. Not forgetting, of course, it was only a few weeks ago that this mysterious seaborne drone seemingly lost control and floated up on the beach of Sevastopol, or in Crimea. So we know that we think Ukraine have been experimenting with drone warfare, subsurface and surface drone warfare. I'm less convinced, partly because it was such a massive bang that I think it would have had to be quite a sizable vessel to have created that, and also relying on, and here I'm relying on smart engineering comment that I've seen from a number of places, which suggests that there would have been much more marking underneath the bridge, the span that we've seen collapse into the water, had the blast been from underneath. So the simple answer is we don't know what caused it. I'm a little bit kind of Occam's razor here, that in the absence of any other very compelling evidence, you've got to go with the simplest and most obvious and strongest suggestion in terms of the evidence available, which is that it was a truck bomb. I mean, that raises all sorts of other questions about was it a suicide device? Was it a suicide bomber? In which case, that's something not only that we don't think we've seen so far in this war, but culturally would be a hell of a leap for Ukraine. So a lot of question marks still over what caused it. Sorry, I've discounted, by the way, that it was a special ops forces raid, a soft raid, special forces raid, simply for the fact that, I mean, it would have been very difficult to do. But hey, that's what these people do. So don't worry about the very difficult bit. But the amount of explosives they would have had to carry, I just think puts it out of reach of it being some sort of SF team doing their business. So I've come back to, unless and until I'm convinced otherwise, I'm going with the truck theory. Now, as I've said, we don't actually know. But I come back to the point I made a couple of days ago. Put all that to one side for a moment. What we do know is that something got through. So Putin, for all his claims to the Russian people and to those in Crimea, trying to sort of quell any rising panic there, that the war's coming to them, him saying, "Don't worry, I can look after you. I control the security environment in my country. You're perfectly safe with me, lads." I mean, that's been demonstrated to be false, because something got through, unless you're claiming it was a Russian special services insider attack to force Putin into an even harder line. But I put that properly off to a corner, worth looking at and then going, don't think so. So I really don't think this was a Russian intelligence agency attack. Putin's come out and called it a terrorist event. He said it was Ukraine's special services, yada yada yada. It's almost irrelevant what he says, because he'll say whatever he needs to say. But I think the important thing to take away from it is that something got through. It's added to this feeling of panic and anxiety and a lack of security amongst Russian people in Crimea. And the important point there is because they will be flooding their own social media channels and messages back home. So it further erodes Putin's ability to say to his people, everything's under control, it's a special military operation, blah, 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 I've got this one all sewn up. So, yeah, a bit of a long-winded way of saying I don't know. But at the moment I'm going with truck bomb, but the important point is that something got through.
Thanks, Dom. As I say, I think it was worth taking some time to discuss that in detail, just because there's been such intense speculation about the nature of that attack, and I knew that you'd have some thoughts and insights on it. I just want to turn now to Roland. Roland, we heard from Sergio yesterday on the ground in Kyiv. You've been elsewhere in Ukraine. Can you just tell our listeners where you are and what you've seen in recent days?
I've just left the Donbas, actually. So the past few days we've been in the Donbas in Donetsk region, which is, as you know, is not only one of the primary theatres of this war, but has been a theatre of war for 8 years. So it's kind of, whenever you go to Donbas, you're returning to towns, cities, roads, landscapes that have been basically the scene of conflict for a very, very long time. And it's always a little bit spooky, really, actually. Anyway, so yesterday, the reason we went there partly, to give you the context, is we felt that we've been hearing an awful lot about Ukrainian success and Ukrainian advance, and we've covered the Kharkiv advance and the Kherson counteroffensive and so on. We've heard much less about where the Russians are pushing forward. And basically, the Russians have continued to push in Donetsk region while all this is going on. In Kharkiv and Kherson, the Russians have continued to push forward in Donetsk, not, very successfully, not very fast, but incremental progress does build up. So one of the key spots is a place called Bakhmut. It was called Artyomovsk until 2016, and sometimes if you're looking at the kind of pro-Russian sources, they sometimes prefer to use that name. So if you ever see, a Russian propagandist talking about a battle near Artyomovsk, he means Bakhmut. Now, Bakhmut's interesting because back in May, June, if you remember that huge, enormous battle for Donbas when Vladimir Putin put in his huge effort to kind of bite off Luhansk and Donetsk region, with that immense, horrendous artillery-backed offensive that just ground down to Severodonetsk. Bakhmut was the Ukrainian strong point, the kind of behind the lines city. So, which was the place of safety, if you want to think about it that way. So, about 25 miles up the highway to the northeast was Lysychansk and Severodonetsk, which was the focus of that battle, which I'm sure our listeners all remember. And about 15 miles to the southeast down another highway, there was an area that the Ukrainians used to call the Svetlodarskaya Duga, the salient, the Svetlodarsk salient. And that was the front line that was established in 2015, basically, after the last big battle of the 2014 to 15 war in Debaltseve. That's where the front line stopped. So Bakhmut it's a major city by Donbas standards. It's strategically placed. It has an important hospital. It has a major market. It has a railway station. It was a place where soldiers were based. Volunteers were running up and down both roads, bringing people in. Bringing in the wounded, bringing in civilians. You had Sergei Gaidai, who was the governor of Luhansk region. He couldn't be in Severodonetsk anymore, couldn't be in Luhansk region anymore, but he was kind of operating out of there. So Bakhmut was not entirely safe. It was under fire in the occasional airstrike, but it was a place you could sit and know that the war was 20 miles away. Today, Bakhmut is the front line. Essentially, there's a river that goes through the city, dividing it between into east and western halves. On the eastern outskirts, the Russians have now a foothold in the city, and the eastern bank is kind of referred to as the grey zone. I suppose in old-fashioned terms, we call it, no man's land. The shelling is God, well, I mean, yesterday it was kind of sluggish, I think, because the weather was so absolutely horrible and no one could get a drone in the air. But it's constant. I mean, even yesterday, locals were telling us, look, this is the quietest it's been in months. And it was a kind of repetitive, thud and boom, going both ways. You could hear the outgoing and the incoming. Like most towns that find themselves in the front line, strangely deserted. That busy marketplace vanished, destroyed, essentially. Lots of shelled out buildings, lots of fear. Every corner there's a horror story, which is, I mean, sadly they're kind of repetitive. I mean, there's a particularly horrible spot where there's a burnt out vehicle that was once an ambulance, and the guy showing us around described how the paramedics were burned alive. So that's the scene there. I mean, I think the takeaway I'd like to give people, one of the important takeaways from yesterday's reporting trip, I think, is the difference between what you actually see on the ground when you go somewhere and what you're going to read on the Telegram channels delivered by either side. So there were kind of reports from either side's propagandists talking about either we repelled a Russian attack on Bakhmut, or the Russians saying we're heavily shelling the Ukrainians and so on and so forth. I mean, look, while I was there yesterday morning, I didn't hear anything that sounded like a really intense fight. I mean, granted, maybe it was going on down the road, but usually you can tell when there's something really serious going on. It was a miserable, heavy day. Today is very, very sunny, and that means drones will be up in the sky, and it makes it much easier to operate artillery, to find targets, and it's just a more pleasant environment to fight in. So I wouldn't be surprised there's more fighting there today. So that's what I've been up to.
Thanks, Roland. It's Dom here. Great to hear from you, mate. If I could jump in with a quick question and ask for your thoughts. So, Bakhmut, we've heard in recent weeks that is the focus for the Wagner group fighting. So we're told that actually there's no coherent Russian army fighting in Ukraine. There's the regulars, then the regulars that have been bolstered by conscripts, and the so-called Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republic militia and Wagner and all the rest of it. None of them are working together nicely. They don't play well in the sandpit, etc., etc. But we've been told that Wagner are concentrating in Bakhmut, have been smashing their head against the wall there, making some limited advances. Have you seen any evidence or heard any evidence of Wagner, or possibly a force that's not the local militia? And just separately, if you think Wagner are either there or being employed in some numbers elsewhere in Ukraine, what are your thoughts on the suggestion that is in order to keep Wagner engaged / distracted, so they are less able to take part in any power plays in Moscow if there was ever a kind of a rush for power in the event of Putin being unseated? Thanks, mate.
Good questions. I'll take the first part first. So the idea that Wagner are the force driving the Bakhmut offensive that's pretty much a consensus. So you can read the Russian military propaganda telegrams, and they always talk about Wagner PMC, private military company, advanced in Bakhmut, or tried to do this in Bakhmut, and that line has almost become kind of like a repetitive gag. You even now see, because they've made so little progress, you'll now see kind of pro-Ukrainians joking that the year is 2025, and Wagner are storming Bakhmut. So the pro-Russian sources say it's Wagner. The Ukrainians say it's Wagner. We were not hanging out with the Ukrainian military yesterday, but we were hanging out with civilians who formed their own volunteer group. They're local guys. They know the place. They were convinced it was Wagner who were over the river and pushing in. They also said, "Oh yeah, we've also got." I think he said 5,000 elite Kadyrovtsi. So 5,000 elite fighters loyal to Ramzan Kadyrov. That's the only person I've heard say that. I have no way to stack it up, but it just gives you an idea of that rumor is going around in Bakhmut as well. But yes, I think we can be fairly sure it's Wagner on the other side. I'm unable to cross no man's land and interview Russian soldiers and ask them which section of the Russian war machine they're from. But I think it's fairly clear that's what's going on. Now, why are Wagner there? I'm afraid I'm going to dodge that political question you laid out. I have no idea whether Wagner are indeed being tied up there so they can't muck around in Moscow. If they weren't fighting in Bakhmut, they would be fighting in other parts of the lines. So I'm not sure you could say Bakhmut is a particular thing that they've been given to keep them tied up, so they don't kind of get distracted. Because no matter what is going on, they are going to be involved in Ukraine. They're going to be kind of tied up in Ukraine. There's a number of theories. I mean, another theory is that they're being paid. That either they're being paid for each assault they make or each day of active military action or combat action, which is why they keep on pushing forward even if they're not making that much progress, perhaps. That's what some of the guys in Bakhmut said to me. These guys are mercenaries and they get paid for fighting, and that's their interest. Maybe there is a what's the word? A bounty on Bakhmut they've been given. You're going to get a big payoff if you get that city. But the Kremlinology you raised there, I think is interesting. I'm a little bit leery of being drawn into it, because I could very easily sit around in a pub with you and kind of spin out all kinds of elaborate theories. I feel like those theories should kind of remain in the pub. I think we have such little realistic grasp of what's happening underneath the carpet in Moscow. It's probably going to do our listeners a disservice to kind of spin things up. It may be entertaining, and I'm happy to entertain people, but I don't want to kind of make things up, if you see what I mean.
Thanks, Roland. Thanks, Dom. Well, this seems like the opportune moment to bring in Natalia, our Russia correspondent. Natalia, you've written a piece for the paper today about Russia's private armies, which we were just talking about there. What's the latest in this area?
Hi, Francis, and hi, everyone. It's very good of Roland to mention Wagner. Obviously, that's the Russian private military contractor that has been quite active in Ukraine. And what really caught my attention yesterday was quite a rare public intervention by Yevgeny Prigozhin, the man behind Wagner, who issued a statement via his press office, essentially challenging Russian lawmakers to fund private armies or go to Ukraine front lines and fight themselves. What makes that intervention quite extraordinary is the fact that Prigozhin for years has been described as a mastermind behind Wagner, behind the infamous troll factory, which was caught interfering in the US presidential elections in 2016. But he was always very low-key. He sued numerous journalists for naming and shaming him for funding Wagner. Now, Prigozhin has been increasingly public, and that was probably his first major political statement when he essentially criticized the State Duma, the lower chamber of the Russian parliament, for being not active enough and being not supportive enough of the invasion. And the way he put it, he basically accused them of, quote, shouting slogans from the rostrum instead of, another quote, taking up automatic rifles or at least sappers' shovels and going to fight, which he described as a true service to motherland. So this is definitely something to watch. There's quite a discussion going on in the Russian analyst community about the rise of Yevgeny Prigozhin, of how public he's becoming. We see his press office or Telegram channels close to him now and again would put out a video of Prigozhin talking to Wagner mercenaries, which is quite rare because for years he was not seen in public. You would have a difficulty finding a picture of him, let alone something that current. So there's a kind of a discussion of what it means, whether he's vying for Putin's attention, whether he might be setting his sights on a senior position in the Russian government. So that's definitely something to watch in the coming weeks. Another thing I wanted to discuss is Joe Biden's interview that came out last night. He spoke to CNN and he spoke about Vladimir Putin, whom he hasn't personally talked to since the start of the invasion. And he offered his views on Putin's rationale behind the invasion. As you know, there's quite a bit of discussion whether Putin honestly believes or believed that Ukrainians will welcome his army with open arms, or whether he's, as some people say, it's sick and he's completely delusional, and just obviously apparently doesn't even know what he's doing. Now, in Joe Biden's opinion, Vladimir Putin, as he put it, is a rational actor who miscalculated the invasion. And did not expect the resistance that Ukrainians offered. Biden said that he believed that Putin was rational within his own framework of mind, that he honestly expected that Ukrainians would welcome his troops with open arms, and that they would be happy to join Russia, just the way as Crimea joined Russia in 2014. This is something that Russia that's how Russia plays it. Obviously, we're talking about an illegal annexation, if it needs to be spelled out. That's quite interesting view from Biden, especially at the time when everyone is talking about a potential nuclear threat from Russia. Weighing possibilities of whether Putin might be in the frame of mind when he would seriously consider this option of using nuclear weapons. So it looks like at this point the US president thinks that Putin is rational within his own framework of mind, as we put it. And that sort of corresponds to what I've been hearing and from what we saw in the opening weeks of the invasion, when several major intelligence leaks showed that the FSB, the Russian intelligence community, has essentially been feeding Putin with misinformation, whether it was deliberate or not, but basically convincing him of this fanciful idea that the Russian army, would have an easy ride and we would be greeted with open arms in Kiev, which didn't happen, in fact.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Talia. Just something I wanted to touch on, since we're on the political sphere, and I've been covering the Elon Musk saga now for some time. There's been a further development in this space in the last 24 hours, which is that Musk is now at the centre of claims that Putin told him personally that he would use nuclear weapons if Ukraine tried to reclaim Crimea. So I should say off the bat that Elon Musk has denied this. He's denied these reports yesterday publicly on Twitter. The reports originally came from Ian Bremmer, who is a very prominent sort of president of a widely respected firm that advises governments about global risks, and he claimed that Musk had told him this personally, which then Musk rebutted, as I say, all live on Twitter. And but the report suggested, as I say, that he was that Putin and Musk had spoken, and that this was the trigger point for Musk to then offer his peace plan that we discussed at length last week. So again, another interesting development. We don't yet know the truth of that, but it does seem strange that Elon Musk, who didn't seem to have much of a deep following of the war, at least not publicly, suddenly became very, very engaged with it in a short space of time. And now, indeed, it is something that he's focusing on almost every day on Twitter. So just thought I would draw attention to that, because I've been covering this quite extensively in the last couple of weeks or so. Roland, go ahead.
Yeah, no, the Musk thing, I think it plays into what, you and Natasha were just discussing about the problem with yes men. So for me, the interesting thing, I don't really give two hoots about where this came from or Elon Musk and what he's up to. But what was interesting to me was the content of this alleged conversation, recounted by Ian Bremmer, which Mr. Musk denies, and so on. If this conversation happened, according to Mr. Bremmer, the contents of Mr. Putin's demands are: look, I'm ready to talk peace, but these are my conditions. And one condition is that Crimea remains Ukraine. Sorry, let me say that Crimea remains Russian in some form. Another condition is that that Ukraine has some kind of neutral status, therefore doesn't join NATO. And the third condition is that Russia's annexation of Zaporizhia, Kherson, Donetsk and Luhansk is recognized, which I just think, I mean, if that really is the thought that Mr. Putin tried to get out via Elon Musk, it just betrays this complete disconnect with reality in two senses. And the first disconnect with reality is that you don't make demands like that unless you're winning the war, and he's not winning the war. I mean, the upshot of that kind of outcome would be basically a large-scale repetition of the Minsk II agreement, which froze the 2014-15 war with a de facto, if not de jure, Russian annexation of parts of Donetsk and Luhansk and Crimea. And that happened, basically, to put it in crude terms, because the Russians won the war. Right? They crushed the Ukrainian army. The Ukrainian army surrounded the Baltova, and Poroshenko had to basically give in to this peace dictated by Mr. Putin. He's not winning, and he's not in a position to make those kinds of demands. And the second thing, which I think is important, is this idea that the first 2 points are, Crimea remains Russian. Well, that was probably going to happen until he started this war. Ukraine remaining neutral, no one was going to let them into NATO. So it's his own fault those are on the table anyway. But also this demand about, okay, now accept my annexation. I think that Mr. Putin has just absolutely no grasp of the attitude in the West, which really goes, he miscalculated about Ukraine. I think he's calculated for a long time that, look, they've always given in to us. They've never, they always give way. There's always a kind of a mercantile, slightly spineless attitude behind all of these, Western statements of values and stuff. It seems to me in Moscow, he doesn't quite grasp how seriously Western elites take what's happening in Ukraine. And I think until that really begins to filter through to the Kremlin, until they begin to grasp that, oh, actually, you know what? It turns out in Washington and London and wherever else, they really do think this is a question of their existential security. And they're not going to, they're not going to roll over and take this thing that we think we can present as a fait accompli. I think there's a massive, massive gulf in the Russian elite's understanding of the West, just as in a way, which is a slightly separate topic, there has been a failure historically in Western elites to grasp Russia. But those are the thoughts that just shone out to me from that incident.
Thanks, Roland. And Natalia, I'm sure you've got some thoughts on this too.
Sure, thanks. Just very quickly, I know that a lot of people who first heard about the possible Musk and Putin conversation were quite surprised that Putin would be talking to someone like Elon Musk to discuss foreign policy. And we know that the Kremlin has officially denied that happened. They did confirm that Putin and Musk had a chat a year and a half ago. But I just wanted to put it into context that it's not the first time that Putin is talking about matters of national importance with celebrities or pop stars. We have seen that happening for quite some time, that Putin, as he has been gradually disappointed and disillusioned with Western politicians, with the Western establishment, he has been trying to reach out to celebrities and pop stars. He's been trying to engage in what some people call people's diplomacy. So we've seen him hosting anyone from French film actor Gérard Depardieu to Hollywood action movie stars Steven Seagal. And he has fostered those relationships. In some ways, for him, it became an outlet, as he saw it, of addressing the American or the French public. As, for example, in his multiple conversation with Steven Seagal, he would always make it look like, we're not the enemies of the American people. And people like Steven Seagal, these are, the sort of salt of the earth. These are the people who actually really represent what Americans think, unlike, the establishment in Washington, D.C. So that's totally not out of character. I would expect that, obviously, as we see, the Kremlin has been anxious to find a way to seek a ceasefire at this point when Russia is suffering losses. I would expect that we're going to see more examples of this people's diplomacy and him trying to talk to quite random people without formal offices behind their backs.
Thanks, Natalia. Dominic Nichols, we're talking a lot here about intelligence and the importance of understanding the way that a people think and an elite think. What did Sir Jeremy Fleming have to say yesterday?
So I went to see Sir Jeremy Fleming. He's the head of GCHQ, Britain's cyber security agency, national intelligence agency, sits alongside the cousins MI5 and SIS, better known as MI6. So GCHQ, he was giving the annual security lecture for RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute, the think tank here in London. So Sir Jeremy was the speaker for that, and he started his career in MI5. He's been leading GCHQ since 2017. So he's a career intelligence officer, career spook. He knows his onions. There we go. I'm trying not to say it. I've been picked up on Twitter from some Australian listeners that onions are colloquialism in that part of the world for testicles. So apologies, I keep saying people know their onions, but there we go. It's my phrase, and I'm going to hang on to it. So Jeremy Fleming, we was asked a number of things. He was highlighting his main part. He was highlighting the rising threat from China in terms of cyber capabilities and norms and standards for internet as we move forward, and quantum computing and AI and all the rest of it. But actually, he was the most interesting bits, the most sort of contemporary and detailed bits. He was talking about Ukraine, and he was asked why we've not seen a lot of cyber attacks in the Ukraine war so far. And he said, actually, there's been a huge amount of cyber activity since February the 24th. And he's like, just not, quote, the film version. He said it's not the Armageddon version, but there's a huge amount of cyber activity going on that he is seeing at GCHQ and that is being perpetrated by Russia against Ukraine. But then on nuclear, he was asked specifically about that. And in terms of, the question was put to him in terms of escalation, these missile strikes post the Kerch Bridge attack. Now, I wrote a couple of days ago that I take issue with the term escalation. I don't think this was an escalation from Russia. This is just what they do. They can do nothing else, so they just fire missiles to terrorize the civilian population in the hope of breaking Ukrainian will and the will of those partners outside Ukraine, keeping them in, or not keeping them, that's far too strong, apologies, but supporting them in the fight. So I don't think it was an escalation, but he was saying that it was not an escalation because it's just more of the same weapons used. However, he did say about the possible use of nuclear weapons. He said it's a very concerning time, very dangerous thing to do. There'd be serious repercussions. He said that he was asked if the intelligence agencies, external, particularly Five Eyes intelligence agencies, would get prior warning, would be able to see through their kind of indicators and warnings and all their assets and what have you, would see preparation. And he said highly likely to see that. However, he said there were no guarantees. Of course, there were no guarantees ever. But he was not talking down the threat at all, because it is a very large threat. He said we'd have a good chance of spotting it, but no guarantees. I think that's about as that says it all. He says, however, we all need to be concerned about the rhetoric. Now, his comments have been echoed by Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO. Today, he's been talking about the chatter around nuclear use. He says this is dangerous and irresponsible, and in particular, he said that long-planned NATO exercises next week, practicing nuclear response, are not going to be cancelled. So this is exercise Steadfast Noon, involves 14 NATO countries. long plan for next week. And Jens Stoltenberg said that to cancel those exercises because of what's happening in Ukraine would send a quote a very wrong signal, unquote. And I think that's quite clever. I think he's right there, because to move away from a very firm line of business as normal, if you like, would give Putin a win, for starters, that he's affected NATO posture, but also it would allow him to then think, if I use the rhetoric that I've been using in the recent past, that then makes NATO do this, and he might draw false conclusions from that, and there'd be this miscalculation brings with it a risk of escalation in and of itself. So I think it was the right move by NATO not to cancel these exercises for next week, even though, I mean, there will be chatter in from I'm imagining Dmitry Peskov, the Russian Defense Ministry spokesperson. He's going to be all over this anytime soon, saying NATO is very provocative having these nuclear exercises. But I think it's the right thing to do not to cancel it, and therefore give Putin some means of analysing. And let's face it, his geostrategic analysis ain't great. So give him a chance to analyse. If I do that, NATO does this. I think would be the wrong thing. Now, Jens Stoltenberg has been speaking in NATO headquarters in Brussels, where today, in fact, right now, there is the latest of the Ukraine Defence Contact Group, otherwise known as the Ramstein process, because it was kicked off by US Defence Secretary Lloyd Austin in the US airbase Ramstein in Germany, so known as the Ramstein process. This is the 6th such meeting. This is a military aid conferences. It's running alongside, just before the monthly NATO Defence Ministerial. So there's some very big power players in the right of the right ilk. So the defence ministers and the national leaders, some national leaders meeting to discuss Ukraine aid. Alexei Reznikov, Ukraine's defence minister, has already tweeted. He says number one on the agenda is strengthening Ukraine's air defence, and he also went on to say, "With great delight that 4 more HIMARS, US HIMARS systems have arrived in Ukraine today." Jens Stoltenberg said that increasing Ukraine's air defence capabilities was the, quote, top priority from the meeting today. And General Mark Milley, who's the chairman of the US Joint Chiefs of Staff, he said, quote, after Russia attacked the Ukrainian civil population, we will be looking for air defence options that will help the Ukrainians defend themselves. Now, I think there were 3 really interesting things there in General Milley's statement. So he said, after Russia attacked the Ukrainian civil population. So clearly laying down those actions have these consequences. And then he says, we'll be looking for air defence options. So really specific here. Okay, we're not talking long-range precision strike. We're not talking drones, not talking medical. I mean, all this stuff happens as well. But the fact that he mentions air defence options, I think is significant. And then finally, that will help the Ukrainians defend themselves. So still against not necessarily a rising tide, but a lot of calls for NATO to get involved, boots on the ground, or if not on the ground, then in the skies and in the waters above and around Ukraine. Mark Milley there being very clear that these defensive military assets will be for Ukrainians to defend themselves, but making it very, very clear that the air defence is the priority, and this is a direct result of Russia attacking the civil population. So I think what we should expect to see out of today are a lot more pledges. The mood in the recent months, you'll remember, was for HIMARS, and it was all no, and then yes, your HIMARS were sent, another long-range precision artillery, and that helped to a very great degree counter Russia's artillery systems and allowed, or was a big part in allowing that the major thrust up in the north and the pushback in the Donbas. So the argument now seems to be shifting from the kind of HIMARS-y, from the long-range precision strike into air defence. Why do I think that's noteworthy? Firstly, because it signals a subtle shift in the emphasis, but also the thing about air defence is that you can't protect everywhere all of the time. Air defence will only be small little bubbles around things of vital interest. You cannot protect an entire city. It's almost impossible to put a big dome over Kyiv and protect the whole thing. Okay, we need to get that point needs to be made more often and at every level, because the push for HIMARS, when that was not as strong as it then subsequently became, it was not so obvious and evident that was lacking. Whereas air defence is, because we see these horrific images of children's playgrounds blown up, of accommodation blocks smashed to bits as if just pummeled by a giant's fist. We see these horrific images. So the failure in air defence, or not having enough air defence, is very, very visible, which is what Putin wants and what we need to prepare ourselves for, because even if Ukraine had every air defence system that NATO and external partners could possibly offer them, some of these strikes would still get through and we would still be bombarded with these images, and it would be a wrong conclusion to take from that, oh my God, there's simply no way of pushing back against the Russians. We should acquiesce and come to terms. Okay, that is the wrong conclusion to take from even a very, very well layered air defence network. But I kind of digress, go sort of off on one there. I apologise for that. So today, NATO, big priority, big focus on air defence. All underpinned, of course, by the constant threats of use of nuclear weapons, potential use of nuclear weapons from Russia. I think very telling comments there from Jeremy Fleming, the head of GCHQ, that they are fairly confident they would see preparations for that, and there is no evidence so far of an increased alert. Interestingly, the Pentagon spokesman a few days ago, in response to the similar question, said that they'd seen nothing to make the US adjust their posture, which is not the strongest sort of response. But yeah, that's what you got from them. They'd seen nothing to make them adjust their posture. But it doesn't look as if Russia is ramping up the physical preparation for any kind of nuclear strike. So I think those comments by Jeremy Fleming were very interesting, and just adds to this wider debate that's moving now into the air defence environment.
Thanks, Dom. Well, as so often, a significant day in both the military and the political spheres, if indeed they can be separated. Thank you all for your insights. We're running out of time, so can I just get your final thoughts today? Starting with Roland, please.
Hello. I always get to the end of these things and realise there's, a lot of things I haven't said, but I'll leave them there. I do have a dispatch coming out about Bakhmut shortly. Please check the website, look at the newspaper for that, and I hope I lay out all the things that I think are important about that battle in there. Two things. Francis, I heard your final thought yesterday about this big question about the future of Russia and liberalism and so on. I don't have the time to get into that discussion. I think it's really interesting. I personally think broadly on the right track there. That's just one little thing. But the other thing is, look, we've just had this announcement this afternoon from the Ukrainian Ministry of Reintegration, I think, saying that 37 children who had been kind of spirited away to Russia have been returned. And this is really good news, basically. Again, this is a story I've been looking at. We may get a piece out about this, but there are legal and ethical issues about writing about children that we want to get our ducks in a row before we publish anything about this. But basically, there was a large number of children from Kharkiv region who were sent to Russia to holiday camps, and the idea that was sold to their parents was, look, get them out of the firing line. A lot of people did that. The Ukrainians liberated the territory. No one knew how they'd get their kids back. Their kids were stuck over in Russia. They seem to have come back, and the kind of little glimmer of hope I see here is that behind the scenes somewhere there has been a little bit of humanitarian cooperation here. People on both sides said, look, kids have to be with their parents. And in fact, I was reading the Telegram channel of Alexander Kots from Komsomolskaya Pravda. Anyone who follows him knows he is an absolute, hawkish Russian nationalist, believes in this horrible war and all of that. But he literally said in his Telegram post, we all knew these kids had to go back to their parents. And if, behind the scenes there can be these tiny, tiny little things where officials on either side say, no, look, forget about the ideology, forget about anything else, let's just keep families together. That, to me, is just a little spark of light in the darkness. which is worth nurturing and focusing on.
Thanks, Roland. And as you say, I know that our intention in the long term is to be able to do a special episode dedicated to this question of deportations, because it's something, as we've talked about in the past, that isn't quite getting the same amount of focus and attention that perhaps it deserves. But Natalia, can I come next to you for your final thought, please?
Sure. I'm going to be try very quick. I think that the whole Twitter scandal about someone tweeting about Putin talking to Elon Musk, and then Musk responding that he never talked to him, although he did support his peace plan, or didn't he support his peace plan. I think it's quite indicative of what's happening. Clearly, the Kremlin is looking for a way out. It's anxious to stop the war as it is, because it keeps losing land. And I think that's something to watch for in the coming weeks, for any signs of formal or informal attempts to, if not build bridges, to at least start some kind of conversation about how to stop this war.
Thanks, Natalia. And Dom, you have the final word.
Well, thanks, Francis. And I think we should be focusing on NATO today and what comes out of the Ramstein 6 meeting, Ramstein number 6 meeting, in particular for air defence, for all the reasons I've said just a little while ago. But just because all Russia can do at the moment, all Russia can do, essentially short of use of nuclear weapons, but I'm in the camp that I think that's extremely unlikely for the reasons we've discussed. All they can do is attack civilian areas, as we've seen. So I wonder if Ukraine is preparing for that ahead of any further advance east in the north and the centre and south around Kherson. So just as they are resting and recuperating their fighting forces that have been going through a hell of a lot in the last couple of months, but as they are recuperating those forces, are they taking this moment to really push the international agenda to get air defence in there? Because when they go again, they know that what will come back at them will be aimed at their civilian areas. I think that's a sensible analysis. I just wonder on the timing, whether or not they've got anything left in the tank this side of winter, or if they will be recuperating over the winter and having the time then to get these air defence systems into Ukraine, better to protect the cities and civilian areas and the national infrastructure ahead of any push. Because I don't see any changes in the Russian army that they have in the field, cognizant of my earlier comment that there's about 5 or 6 different armies in the field, but they've got no battlefield response. So Ukraine know what will happen now if and when they push again, and I think they are sensibly preparing for that. We should also prepare for that mentally and emotionally, as well as those that can, lending material support, because, as I say, something will always get through, and there will always be more of these images, and this might be the shape of things to come. If Ukraine continue their advance, then it's the civilians who will bear the brunt of that advance, and there will be many calls stimulated and pushed by bots and the Russian proxies saying, look what you're doing to your people, Zelensky, look what you are doing to the Ukrainian people with your supplies, Westerners, or those outside the country. And we have to prepare ourselves for those awful images and those difficult arguments, because that's all that Russia has got left in the tank.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 30 days completely free at telegraph.co.uk/audio. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app, and if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. To our listeners on YouTube, for reasons beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear an episode as soon as it is available, please do subscribe to a podcast app or check the Ukraine page on the Telegraph website. As ever, you can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing podcasts@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. We are especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest is produced by Louisa Wells and Giles Gear, and today on Twitter, Claire Hubble.